All right.
Wait.
Hello. Hi. Would you mind terribly? So, I have a presentation to do. Hello there. I am Ambrose Benner, and I am doing a thing about tanks. I'm doing a thing. This is my Pechakucha project about the development of the M1 Abrams, specifically in reference to its continued viability in the future of warfare. So, let's talk first. What is a tank? You know, that might sound like a very obvious question at first. However, you do start to realize that there are more moving components than there appear to be on the surface. So, is a tank just something which is armored and has a gun? Because if that's the case, then that's a tank. But that doesn't have treads. So what? Does it need to have treads? Well, if it's just treads, then you'd have snowmobiles being tanks. So a tank, generally, there's not a strict definition. So more generally, you just have to go as what it's used doctrinally. So if it's used to, like, for instance, burst through heavy fortifications and support infantry, then you would sort of consider that a tank. So it's more loose, the definition of a tank. So what constitutes tanks? Like, what makes up the design of tanks? What's the motivation? So generally, originally, you had something called the iron triangle of mobility, protection, and firepower. It's sort of the idea that a tank can be fast and maneuverable over rough terrain. It can be fast and off-road, or that's the mobility sphere. Firepower is in reference to, very obviously, for example, your main cannon. That's your armament, your ability to also suppression fire. So with things like machine guns and anti-infantry weapons, your capacity to shut down enemy infantry. That's generally that sphere. Protection that's the one that's changed the most. Originally, it was mostly just in reference to your armor. Directly, like, how many inches of steel do you have between you and death? However, we've sort of got more advanced from there. You now have things like trophy systems, explosive reactive armor, soft kill, hard kill systems, but we'll get to that later. We'll talk about that. But generally, this is the sort of basis of and motivation for most tank design. So, what motivated the creation of the tank? Well, you have this thing called World War I, the Great War, the war to end all wars. And what was it started by? Well, boom goes the Archduke, and all of Europe is at war. Why? Because they're all saying, hey, if you go to war with my buddy over here, I'm going to go to war with you. So basically all of Europe went to war with each other because Serbia blew up an Archduke, and then, whoopsies, everybody's at war. So, World War I was a very unique circumstance. It was a very odd series of events which led up to it, and as such, it had a very odd sort of general basis. Pictured here is combat in World War I. And if you notice here, this is not very fun looking. Why? Because there was this sort of general idea of trench warfare. Most combat took place in opposing trenches. So you dig a big old hole, and you set all your guns there, and you look at the other guy, who's also in a hole with his guns, and you just sort of like, wait, because there's nothing you can really do, because if you stand up out of your hole, you are down in the open, liable to get shot with their guns. And in the middle, in between you two, there are all sorts of landmines, barbed wire, and in areas like Verdun, Passchendaele, what happened was, in these French areas, there was so much rain and torrential downpour that the ground turned into liquid death, basically. One first-hand account, one diary of a French soldier, described it as tapioca. In fact, there were instances where artillery shells would come up into the air, drop into the mud, and bury themselves there 10 feet below the surface. So there were also accounts during the Battle of Passchendaele of, quite literally, hundreds of men drowning in mud. So this sucked! People didn't want to walk through that. So what do? Well, you already have these things called, like, armored cars. They're like cars, but, like, with armor on them. So what if we extended that idea? What if we made something which could theoretically cross this no man's land, this hellish, awful plane of death, and we get something to do it which isn't made of flesh and blood? Well, that idea led to the creation of Big Willie here. This was a design made by the British Landship Committee, which was a group of defense contractors who intended to make a, quote, tank. The term tank actually comes from its code name. It was referred to as the water-carrying tank. They told the factories which were producing the tanks that they were making water carriers, but in actuality they were referred to as land ships. That was their official designation. So you
Just click.
Thank you. So you started to see this design. What do they want? Well, because of all that awful stuff in World War One, what they wanted was something which could cross no man's land. So it needs to be able to off-road. Then they also wanted it to be able to sustain enemy fire because you have all these mounted machine guns. So you need something which is impervious to machine gun fire. And then the third, even if you get to the enemy, what are you gonna do to the enemy? Give them a firm handshake and say, hey, I don't like you, go away. No. What you need to do was you need to attach guns to it as well. So we go back to the original 3 elements of the Iron Triangle, remember? Mobility, firepower, and protection. Those were all generally the considerations made when creating the Big Willie. So this was the first tank. And the British introduced it quickly, but they didn't actually use it. It never really saw combat because it was replaced by the Mark I tank. And once the British introduced the Mark I tank, all hell broke loose. So it opened the floodgates. Pictured here.
We got it.
Hi, hello, welcome back. The Brits, right? They make their tank, the Mark I. It rolls onto the battlefield and it is wildly successful. Why? Because it can cross that aforementioned no man's land and actually make it to the other enemy trench and dislodge their soldiers. So everybody sees this and goes, okay, we need one of those. So you begin to see French designs. Where is it here? Pictured here somewhere. But you have, German designs. So you have German designs, French designs, American designs, British designs. Everybody wants a tank because they're great. So you start to see just this rapid development and just all sorts of different designs. Oh, goodness. Oh, dearie me. Okay. So what does the tank actually do? We sort of briefly touched on it before, but the idea is to drive a wedge through the enemy. The idea is you roll it up over no man's land and into the enemy trench and blow everybody up. That's pretty much all it was intended to do at the beginning. Although you did have, originally with British tanks, there was a separation, 2 denominations for British tanks, male and female tanks, and then later you had introduced hermaphrodites. The way it worked was basically either you had a cannon or you had machine guns. Machine guns were female, cannons were male, and then hermaphrodites had both. So the hermaphrodite design would eventually begin to sort of eclipse the male and female designations and become the de facto idea of the tank. So they had machine guns and they had cannons. What they would do is they would go up and they would use the cannon to blow up any heavy fortifications, and they used the machine gun to mow down any unprotected enemy infantry. So that was the sort of idea. They were to go up, soak in all the fire, and destroy anything in their way. They were basically a big old distraction, right? And then the World War I ended. So that happened, right? But we're just, World War I. That implies the existence of a sequel. But before that, you had sort of here a development after the war. You begin to see all sorts of terrible and wonderful designs come in. So this, for example, is a French tank. They sort of come up with this idea of revolving turrets. Originally, tanks didn't have those, but now you have a turret on top so you can move around. You don't just have to have your cannon and move your entire tank to aim. You can move the turret and not the rest of the tank. So that was one of the most massive inventions. Another was by the British. The idea of cavalry and infantry tanks. Infantry tanks were as before, basically like World War I. The idea behind it was that they were big, heavily armored, and they would roll up and attack the enemy, right? And they were sort of slow, more heavily armored, and more heavily armed. But you also had cavalry tanks, which were faster, lighter, and more maneuverable. Those are meant to do what horses had traditionally done, because World War I saw really the death of traditional cavalry, right? Because you don't see anybody going around on horses now like, yah, yah. You're not going to see that in Ukraine. Because people use tanks now. You have all sorts of armored cavalry instead. And then the sequel happens, World War II. So at this point, tanks have become incredibly widespread. They're everywhere. Every nation has one, and they have multiple. So pictured here is the Russian T-34. They had multiple series of tanks, the Soviets. So you had the Soviets with their T-34s, that was their main medium tank. You also had Germans, they had their Panzer models. The Panzer III was known as the most successful, though they also had the Panther and Tiger tanks. The Americans had notably the Sherman, and the British had several. They had the Matilda, the Churchill, many different tanks. But generally, what you start to see is a more diversification. The tanks start getting different, more diverse. They start changing. So before you just really had tanks, and then the British widened it to infantry and cavalry tanks. But now you also begin to see more specific designations: tank destroyers, artillery support. The idea of the armored vehicle really comes into vogue. You start getting different variations. It's not just tank, tank. You now have variety there. But then also, so what does the tank do in World War II? I apologize. So as I had said, the world becomes more diverse. They start doing different things. And that's sort of where it is. They can do basically anything. It's the basic formula of big armored thing can serve any purpose. And you start to get a sort of more of a shift to modularity, which is where we come to here. After World War II, look at the Americans. They have the Firefly, which is a variation of the Sherman. So you had the Sherman and the Pershing, really. You had a medium tank and a heavy tank, and you also had light tanks and armored cars. All this is really convoluted, right? That's so much work to just deploy multiple tanks for every situation. So people don't want that. They don't want to have a specific tool for every job. They want a Swiss Army knife. So what they do is you have this sort of idea of this concept of the main battle tank. You start to get to see more modularity and flexibility. People don't want to have a medium, light, and heavy tanks. They just want tank again, but this tank can serve more roles. In addition, you also see sort of modular vehicle designs. So like the HIMARS system currently, it can be modified whether through its armament, its engine, or its armoring to be any sort of a different vehicle. So that leads us to this is more of the sort of idea of modern warfare. You have combined arms warfare. Pictured here, you have land forces, armored vehicles, and air support, because they all need to work in combination, because each one can only do so many things. Despite the increased emphasis on flexibility, there's only so much a single vehicle can do. So that's why they're paired with infantry and air support. This is now the modern model. You don't just have tanks now, you have tanks and infantry and your planes up above. So then, this brings us to America. The US of A, right? So previously, they'd mostly been mooching off of British models early in tank development history. So there was the Mark V International tank, which was a combination British and American effort. But that was sort of like, but then they also began to purchase British models, like also use of the Christie suspension, which is a British invention. But after that, they were like, all right, scrap that, we need our own tanks. So they start making, pictured here, the Sherman. It was their own design. It was their own take on a tank. That was when you begin to see American originality. But that was the medium tank. They also had the Pershing heavy tank, which was introduced more towards Korea. But so there's that. That's sort of the general feel of American tank design. And then we get this lovely thing, the Abrams. So the US needs to develop a main battle tank. They need to catch up with the rest of the world because they don't want to have to deal with medium tanks and heavy tanks because, again, we've discussed before, that's a hassle. Nobody wants that. They just want tank, which they can roll out and blow up people with, right? So enter the Abrams. They go to general engineering. I apologize. General Dynamics. I apologize. My brain is not working. General Dynamics, they're a defense contractor, and they say, hey, build us a tank. So they do. They build the Abrams. So you can see its first use was during the Iraq War in Operation Desert Storm. It was wildly successful. It was basic. It was the top dog. Nothing could even stand close. It was the best, right? Just look. Behold its majesty. So, where does it lead us? Well, today, this is a destroy tank. Why? Because tanks can be blown up very easily. Despite their perceived tankiness, tanks are in fact very vulnerable. So let's talk about modern war. Modern war often has a large focus on urban warfare. In cities, in towns, because you have these insurrections and rebels. And look at Afghanistan, our country's most recent engagement. There you had the insurgents and rebels and general bad guys were intermixed with regular civilians inside cities. And now that's sort of the general face of war now. It's no longer open battlefields for the most part. More often than not now, your engagements take place in urban areas. And because of that, tanks are very prone to ambush with things like landmines, which have destroyed this here tank. So things like landmines or even rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, disposable man-portable weapon systems, which can very easily destroy a tank. So nowadays, there is a lot of focus on not necessarily just being able to just tank hits and just be like really tough, right? Now we have a more sophisticated defense systems for tanks. You have smoke screens, EMPs, explosive reactive armor. These are all new measures which have been developed to counteract the increased anti-tank abilities of the world. So, what is the Abrams doing? Where's the Abrams in all this? Well, this is the Abrams X. It's produced by General Dynamics. It's a new model. Basically, it's a stealth tank. That's sort of the idea there. But the Abrams has been advancing. It's not just the Abrams anymore. Originally, it was the M1, but now you have the M1A2 Abrams, because there are now different modifications of it. There are different upgrade packages, which are all introduced to increase its capabilities and keep it viable. Because you don't just spend billions of dollars building a tank and then say, all right, it's been 10 years, throw it in the trash. No, what you want to do is you want to keep that tank as long as you can. You want to keep everything viable as much as possible. So how viable is the Abrams in the current day? Let's talk about it. So there is perhaps a general focus in the military arms community and general perception that it's all about the hardware. It's all about the machines. But in reality, oftentimes, what you need is not a better tank, but a better crew, better training, more personable and agreeable commanders, commandants. You need better training. It's man over machine. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if I give a baby a tank. It can't drive the tank. So that leads us to our next point. You need to be very careful with how you tank, more or less. You have to just pick your battles carefully, because you can't just go driving into the midst of a town filled with enemy rebels who are ensconced within heavy fortification. That's a bad idea. Don't do that. Pick and choose your battles. Don't just go running into somewhere you are not prepared. Bring infantry. Bring air support. Be very careful. And that leads me to my conclusion here. The Abrams is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. It's the US's tank. It will continue to evolve and will continue to grow. Currently, over here, the Abrams X. That's another modification of the tank. There's also the proposed package, the A3. It will continue to develop with war, with the world. And that is sort of what I'm saying here. Sure, it can be effective, but really the main effect it has is the ability to adapt, the ability to continue to thrive. That is all.